Now let's move on to next library, which is Seaborn. Seaborn is a library for data visualization. Most commonly used library is Matplotlib, but for our course, we think that Seaborn is much more suited. That's why we will be discussing Seaborn only. If you want, you can learn about Matplotlib on your own. First, we will import the Seaborn library. We will write import Seaborn as SNS. So we have imported Seaborn as SNS. Now, to plot the distribution of our age variable from our customer table, we'll write SNS dot diskplot. In bracket, I will mention my column name, that is customer data 2 dot age, capital A G E. You can see this is histogram of our age variable. This first creating bins of all the ages. So the minimum value in our age variable is 18 and the maximum is 17. Python has created different bins between these two values, and then it plotted the number of variables in those bins in the form of bars. This is called histogram. You can see most of our customer are in this last bucket. This line is also known as KDE, kernel density estimate, and we are not going into explanation on how to arrive on this line. So we are just going to remove this line. To remove this line, we'll write sns.diskplot data2.age and then KDE equal to false. You can see now the KDE line is removed. If you want to see arguments of any function, you can just write help and in bracket you can write that function. For example, in our case, we'll write sns.diskplot. It will show you the syntax of that function, all the variables that it is taking, and the default values of those variables. So by default, KDE was true. That's why we were getting the KDE plot. And you can change the value to false to remove the KDE. Similarly, there are other variables as well. You can create a rug plot if you write rug equal to true. You can have a look at this and read the documentation. Now we will change the color of this graph. As you can see, color is also a variable. We will just write sns.diskplot. Color equal to red. Red in double quotes. Run this. You can see the color has now changed to red. Seaborn library comes with various data sets. Now we will just import one of such database, also known as iris. So we'll write iris. Iris is our name of variable containing iris dataset. Then we'll write sns dot load underscore dataset, and in bracket we'll write iris. We'll run this. We can view a sample of this dataset by using iris.head. So our data contains 5 columns: sepal length, sepal width, petal length, petal width, and species. This is the data of flowers where we have sepal length and sepal width and petal length and petal width, and then the species of that flower. To get the number of columns, we'll write iris dot shape and run this. You can see there are total 150 rows and there are 5 columns. If you want to get the mean value, median value, minimum value, and maximum value, we can also write iris dot describe. This will show us some statistics of all these 4 columns. Now we'll plot a scatter plot between sepal length and sepal width. To do that, we'll write SNS dot joint plot. Our x variable should be sepal length. We'll write sepal length, and y variable is sepal width. Write sepal width, and then our data is iris. If we run this, we are getting a scatter plot between sepal length and sepal width. On the top, we have a distribution of sepal length, and on the right hand side, we have a distribution of sepal width. There are other variations of this scatter plot also. If you want to change the color of these dots, the size of these dots, if you want a KDE plot with this histogram, a KDE plot or a rug plot here, you can find all this with the help option of joint plot, and we will discuss that during our univariate analysis. Next, another important function is pair plot. So while doing our analysis, instead of plotting scatter plot for all the variables, we can do it for all the variables using just one command, that is sns.pairplot, and in bracket we just have to mention the data frame, that is iris. It will create a scatter plot for all the variables. For example, this is a distribution of sepal length. This is a scatter plot of sepal length and sepal width. This is a scatter plot of sepal length and petal length. And this is a scatter plot of sepal length and petal width. This is a very useful command, and in a single command we can get a scatter plot for all our variables. That's all for this video, and that's all for Python crash course. This is just a crash course. We are not covering anything in deep, and as we go along we'll discuss all these things in more detail and its application.